The stars stretched infinitely in all directions, a glittering sea of silent constellations. Marcus always found solace in their cold, unwavering beauty. But tonight, those stars were nothing more than a mocking audience to his impending doom. The alarms on his ship blared in deafening warning as sparks flew from the control panels. His hands gripped the steering yoke tightly, knuckles white as he fought to stabilize the ship. The vessel, a well-worn but reliable freighter, groaned under the sudden pressure of atmospheric entry. Somewhere between Vardan's Reach and the Indara trade route, an asteroid had torn into his engine housing, sending his systems into a catastrophic failure. Marcus's pulse raced as he frantically scanned the nearby space for a habitable landing spot. The readout on his console was a blur of red warnings: oxygen levels depleting, engine power critical, hull integrity compromised. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, but he couldn't spare a second to wipe it away. He had mere moments to make a decision, to find a way out of this death spiral before the ship ripped itself apart. There it was, on the edge of his scanner, a barren, rocky planet, its surface marked by jagged mountains and swirling dust storms. Vika Prime. The name struck a chord in his mind, triggering faint memories of old spacer tales. It was not the kind of place anyone would willingly visit. Desolate, hostile, crawling with creatures whose sole existence was to devour anything unlucky enough to land on their planet. But it was the only option. "Come on, girl, just hold together," Marcus muttered to the ship, as if sheer will could keep the failing vessel in one piece. The ship shuddered violently as it broke through Vika Prime's atmosphere, and the nose dipped dangerously. His fingers moved instinctively over the controls, adjusting for the sudden turbulence as the planet's harsh winds caught the freighter like a leaf in a storm. Outside the viewport, the planet's surface rushed toward him, an unforgiving landscape of jagged cliffs and blackened earth. He needed to slow the descent, or he'd be nothing more than a crater upon impact. With a growl of frustration, Marcus yanked the emergency thrusters, hoping they hadn't been damaged by the asteroid collision. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sputter and a roar, the thrusters kicked in, giving just enough resistance to pull the ship into a rough glide. The landing was far from graceful. The freighter hit the ground hard, skidding across the rocky terrain with a screech of tearing metal and the crunch of shattered rock beneath it. Marcus was thrown forward against his restraints, the impact slamming the breath from his lungs. The ship groaned one final time before coming to a halt, tilted at an awkward angle on a ridge of jagged stone. Dust swirled around the cracked viewport as silence settled in the aftermath of the crash. Marcus sat there for a moment, his body aching from the force of the landing, the only sound the ragged rhythm of his breathing. He tasted blood and realized he'd bitten down hard on his lip during the descent. Forcing himself to breathe deeply, he slowly unbuckled his restraints and stood, feeling the unsettling tilt of the ship beneath him. "Still alive?" he muttered, his voice hoarse, filled with disbelief and grim humor. He glanced around. The cockpit sparks still popped from damaged panels, and the once steady hum of the ship's systems was now an ominous silence. The ship wasn't going anywhere without extensive repairs, that much was clear. But first things first, he needed to get outside and assess the damage. Grabbing his pack, which was still mercifully intact, Marcus stumbled to the hatch. The emergency manual release groaned under the pressure as he forced it open, and the hatch cracked with a reluctant hiss, exposing him to the harsh winds of Vika Prime. Stepping out onto the rocky surface, Marcus was greeted by a landscape that was as brutal as he had feared. Towering cliffs stretched into the sky, their jagged edges cutting into the swirling dust-filled air. The ground was uneven and treacherous, littered with sharp rocks and the twisted remnants of long-dead trees. The sky above was a hazy gray, obscured by thick clouds that promised more danger than shelter. He crouched beside the ship, surveying the damage. The port engine was nearly sheared off, hanging by a few tenuous connections of twisted metal. Black smoke billowed from the gaping wound in the ship's hull where the asteroid had struck, and Marcus grimaced. This wasn't going to be an easy fix. Maybe not even a fix at all. But he had to try. There was no choice. No one came to Vika Prime, no trade routes, no nearby space stations. He was alone, and the only thing standing between him and the lethal creatures of this planet was his crippled ship. As he turned to head back inside and gather tools, a sound reached him, faint, almost swallowed by the gusting wind, but unmistakable. It was a cry for help. Marcus froze, his instincts warring with logic. It didn't make sense. He was the only living thing for miles, wasn't he? Or was it some kind of trick, a predator luring him into the open? The stories about Vega Prime's creatures flashed through his mind, beasts that could mimic the cries of their prey to draw them in. The cry echoed again, more urgent this time, and despite the warning bells going off in his mind, Marcus found his feet moving toward the sound. Gripping his blaster tightly in one hand, he followed the echoes, stepping carefully over the jagged rocks and watching the cliffs for any signs of movement. The terrain grew more treacherous as he ventured deeper into the canyon. The wind howled between the towering cliffs, and every sound seemed amplified, distorted. Still, the cries persisted, growing weaker, but somehow more desperate. Marcus rounded a bend in the canyon, and there, nestled among a cluster of jagged rocks, he saw her. At first he thought she was a statue, a strange formation carved by the wind. Her skin was the color of vibrant moss, unlike anything Marcus had ever seen, and it shimmered faintly under the harsh light of Vega Prime's sky. Her body lay crumpled in the shadow of a towering rock, her eyes half closed and glowing softly, the only sign of life in her fragile form. He approached cautiously, his blaster still drawn, but something in the way she lay, so still and so broken, made him lower the weapon. This was no predator. She was real, a living being, barely hanging on. Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her, and Marcus saw the fear in them. She tried to move, but her body failed her, too weak to resist or flee. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and her clothes, what remained of them, were torn and stained with dried blood. Hey, it's okay," Marcus said softly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. Of course he couldn't understand him, but the tone of his voice was universal, and he hoped it would be enough to calm her. The alien girl, because that's what she was, unmistakably alien, looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. He saw the panic, the mistrust, the raw terror in them. She tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly, but whatever language she spoke was lost to him. Marcus felt a surge of helplessness. How could he reassure her when he couldn't even communicate? Slowly, deliberately, Marcus reached into his pack and pulled out a small canister of water. He twisted the cap and poured a small amount onto a cloth, holding it out to her in a gesture of peace. Her eyes flicked between the cloth and his face, uncertainty warring with desperation. After a long moment, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the cloth from him. Marcus watched as she pressed it to her cracked lips, the cool water offering her some relief. He could see the exhaustion in every movement, the way her body trembled from the effort of even that small action. Whoever she was, whatever had happened to her, she had been through hell. "You're going to be okay," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand the words but hoping she could feel their intent. He wasn't sure if he was saying it to reassure her or himself. With a glance at the darkening sky, Marcus realized he couldn't leave her here. Night was coming fast, and on a planet like this, that meant one thing: danger. Whatever creatures prowled Vega Prime's surface would be out soon, and the girl wouldn't survive another night in the open. Making a quick decision, Marcus slid his arms under her fragile body, lifting her as gently as he could. She was light, too light, as if starvation and injury had hollowed her out. She stiffened in his arms, a soft whimper escaping her lips, but she didn't resist. Perhaps she was too weak to fight, or perhaps she had simply given up hope. But Marcus hadn't. Not yet. "I've got you," he murmured, carrying her back toward his ship, his heart heavy with the weight of this unexpected responsibility. The wind howled against the hull of the damaged freighter, a relentless reminder of the planet's harsh environment. Inside, the low hum of the ship's dwindling power systems echoed through the dimly lit corridors. Marcus sat on the floor beside the alien girl, her small body resting against the makeshift cot he had fashioned out of his ship's emergency supplies. The cabin smelled faintly of burnt circuits, an antiseptic, an unfortunate blend of his repairs, and the hurried medical treatment he had given her wounds. Zira, as Marcus had come to call her in his mind, was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Her strange green skin, which had first shimmered under the planet's cruel light, now seemed dull and ashen. She looked even more fragile up close, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for dragging her back to this broken-down ship. But what else could he have done? Leaving her out there, alone and vulnerable to the planet's deadly predators, wasn't an option. The ship shuddered again as another gust of wind slammed into it, rattling the few remaining intact windows. Marcus glanced around the cockpit, eyeing the various cracks and damage. He had done what he could to patch up the hull, but it was a temporary solution at best. Vika Prime was unforgiving, and time was not on his side. He needed to repair the ship properly if they had any hope of escaping this desolate world. But for now, his attention was divided. His gaze returned to Zira, her alien features serene but pained. Even in unconsciousness, her brow furrowed as though haunted by memories too terrible to forget. Marcus felt a strange pull and need to protect her, though he knew next to nothing about her. Who was she? What had happened to her? The only clues were the shredded remnants of her clothing and the scars that marred her skin. Whatever story she carried, it was etched into her body with violence and suffering. Marcus leaned back, running a hand through his tangled hair. He was exhausted. The crash, the constant repairs, and now Zira, it was wearing him down. Still, he couldn't rest, not yet. There was too much at stake. He sighed and stood up, stretching out the kinks in his back. His legs felt stiff from sitting for too long, and his muscles ached from hauling parts and supplies. Moving quietly, he crossed the cabin and checked his makeshift workstation, a clutter of tools, spare parts, and data pads spread across the floor. The ship's engine systems were still offline, and the power reserves were dangerously low. If he didn't get the engines back up soon, they'd be left in the dark, completely exposed to the planet's night terrors. He grabbed a wrench and headed toward the rear of the ship, where the engine room lay in disarray. The acrid stench of burnt wiring hit him the moment he opened the hatch, and Marcus wrinkled his nose in distaste. He knelt down beside the exposed engine core, his fingers deftly twisting bolts and rewiring circuits. It was slow, grueling work, but it kept his mind focused, a distraction from the oppressive silence and the weight of Zira's presence. As he worked, the hours slipped by unnoticed. The wind outside continued to batter the ship, and the distant calls of Vika Prime's creatures occasionally pierced the air. Each sound sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. He had seen the damage those predators could do, and he knew that without the ship's shield and engine, they were vulnerable. But soon Marcus's focus was interrupted by a soft sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the clinking of his tools. He paused, his body tense, listening. It came again this time, clearer. A moan, weak and pained. Marcus scrambled to his feet, abandoning his tools as he rushed back toward the cabin. As he entered, he found Zira stirring on the cot. Her glowing eyes were flickering open, their light weak but unmistakable. Her movements were slow, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but she was awake. Finally.
Hey, take it easy, Marcus said gently, dropping to one knee beside her. He held his hands up, palms open, trying to convey peace with his body language. You're safe here.
Zira blinked slowly, her glowing eyes locking onto his. There was confusion in her gaze, and something else, fear, perhaps, or maybe mistrust. She tried to sit up, but her strength failed her, and she slumped back against the cot, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her lips moved as if she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Marcus reached for the canteen beside him, pouring a small amount of water into a cup. Here, he said softly, offering the cup to her. You need to drink. She eyed the cup warily, her hands trembling as she took it. For a moment, Marcus thought she might refuse, but then she brought the cup to her lips and drank. Slowly, cautiously, as if each drop was precious. Marcus watched her, relieved to see her taking in the water. She was still so fragile, still hanging on the edge of survival, but at least she was conscious. It was progress. When she finished, she lowered the cup and stared at him, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. There was a palpable tension between them, an unspoken wariness. She didn't trust him, and why should she? Marcus was a stranger, a different species, on a planet that had likely shown her nothing but cruelty. I'm Marcus, he said slowly, placing a hand on his chest. He tapped his fingers against his skin, trying to convey his name through simple gestures. Marcus. She blinked, her brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to comprehend his words. After a moment, she hesitantly raised her hand, tapping her own chest in response. Zira. The sound of her voice, soft and musical, despite the rasp of dehydration, caught Marcus by surprise. Her accent was thick, the syllables foreign, but he understood it nonetheless. Zira. A name to go with the mysterious figure he had found broken and bleeding in the canyon. He nodded slowly, repeating her name in the hopes of creating a bridge between them. Zira. A flicker of recognition passed through her eyes, though the mistrust remained. She glanced around the cabin, her gaze darting from the sparse interior of the ship to the makeshift medical supplies strewn across the floor. Marcus could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was trying to piece together the situation, trying to determine if she was truly safe or simply out of the frying pan and into the fire. As much as Marcus wanted to offer her comfort, he knew that words alone wouldn't do the job. Actions mattered more here. He moved slowly, standing up and stepping back to give her space. She needed to feel in control, even in her weakened state. The last thing she needed was to feel cornered by a stranger. "I'm not here to hurt you," Marcus said quietly, unsure if she could understand his words but hoping the tone conveyed enough. "I found you out there. You were hurt. I brought you here to help." Zira's eyes narrowed again, but she didn't speak. Instead, she glanced down at her body, her fingers lightly brushing the bandages wrapped around her arms and torso. The makeshift dressings Marcus had applied after treating her wounds with the limited medical supplies he had on board were crude, but they had held. The bleeding had stopped, and for the first time, Marcus noticed the faint glow returning to her skin. She let out a soft breath and sank back against the cot, her body visibly relaxing. Whether it was exhaustion or a growing acceptance of her situation, Marcus couldn't tell, but it was a good sign. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Who was she? How had she ended up here? What had happened to her people? And perhaps most importantly, what was he supposed to do next? Marcus knew he couldn't stay on this planet forever. The ship's repairs were his top priority, but he couldn't just leave Zira behind either. She was too weak to survive on her own, and something inside him, something he couldn't quite explain, made him feel responsible for her now. She was a refugee, abandoned and broken in a hostile world, and Marcus was the only one who could help her. "I need to fix the ship," he said slowly, miming the motion of repairing the engine with his hands. "I can't stay here. I need to get us out of here." Zira's eyes followed his movements, and after a long pause she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a flicker of understanding. Encouraged, Marcus stood up and gestured toward the cockpit. "Stay here. I'll keep working on the ship. If you need anything, call for me." He wasn't sure if she would, but it was the best he could offer. Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and made his way back to the engine room, his mind already running through the list of repairs he needed to finish. As he crouched back down to continue working on the engine core, he couldn't shake the feeling of Zira's eyes still on him, watching from the shadows of the cabin. Hours passed, the heavy weight of time dragging on as Marcus worked on the ship. He had managed to get the auxiliary power back online, though the main engines were still far from operational. Every system was a patchwork of hastily rigged circuits and worn-out components, but it would have to do. He had no choice. His body ached from the effort, his muscles stiff from the cramped conditions. Sweat dripped from his brow, mixing with the grime on his hands. Still, he kept going, driven by the need to get off this forsaken planet. The creatures outside were growing bolder. He could hear their cries in the distance, their howls carried on the wind like a haunting chorus. He had no desire to face them, not with Zira still in such a vulnerable state. It wasn't until late into the night that Marcus heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. He turned, surprised to see Zira standing in the doorway of the engine room. She was still weak, her body swaying slightly, but there was determination in her glowing eyes. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, stepping toward her cautiously. He wasn't sure how much strength she had regained, but she shouldn't be walking yet, not in her condition. Zira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the engine core, then back at Marcus, her eyes narrowing slightly. She pointed at the mess of tools and broken components scattered across the floor, then made a series of quick gestures with her hands. It took Marcus a moment to understand, but then it clicked. She was trying to help. Know how to fix this, he asked, motioning toward the engine. Zira nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Marcus blinked, momentarily taken aback. He hadn't expected that. But then again, why should he be surprised? She had survived a pirate attack, escaped onto a hostile planet, and endured untold horrors. Of course she had skills. And right now, any help was better than none. "All right," he said, stepping aside to give her room. "Let's see what you can do." Zira moved slowly, her steps careful as she crouched beside the engine core. Her hands, though trembling from weakness, moved with a practiced precision as she began to inspect the damage. Marcus watched in silent awe as she worked, her fingers deftly rewiring circuits and adjusting components he hadn't even noticed were malfunctioning. Together they worked in near silence, the only sounds the soft clinking of metal and the low hum of the ship's systems slowly coming back online. Despite the language barrier, there was an unspoken understanding between them, two strangers, bound by necessity, working toward the same goal. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself glancing at Zira more and more, not just out of curiosity but out of admiration. She was stronger than he had given her credit for, and as they worked side by side, he realized something else: he trusted her. For the first time since he had landed on Vega Prime, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this together. The air inside the freighter had grown thick and stifling, a near constant reminder of the failing filtration systems. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands slick with grease and grime, as he worked tirelessly on the final touches to the ship's engine. Despite the progress he and Zira had made, there was still so much left to do before the ship would be ready for flight. Time was running out, and he could feel the pressure building with each passing day. Zira, who had surprised him with her knowledge of engineering, was perched beside him, her glowing eyes fixed on a set of circuit boards she had pulled apart for repair. Her delicate fingers moved with a precision that Marcus could only admire. Though she still looked frail, her determination was undeniable. Each day she seemed to regain a little more of her strength, her body recovering from the ordeal she had endured before Marcus found her. It had been days since she had first spoken her name, and though their conversations were limited by the language barrier, they had formed an unspoken bond. It wasn't just the necessity of survival that brought them together, but something deeper: a mutual understanding, a growing sense of trust. The ship creaked again, a low groan from the hull, as another gust of wind battered the exterior. Vega Prime was relentless in its assault, its weather unpredictable and its terrain unforgiving. Every time Marcus looked out of the cockpit windows, he was reminded of the desolate landscape. They were trapped in rocky canyons stretching out in all directions, dotted with cliffs that seemed to reach for the sky. It was during one such glance, when Marcus leaned back from his work and wiped his hands on his shirt, that he caught sight of movement out of the corner of his eye. At first he dismissed it as the wind stirring the dust. But then he saw it again, a quick flash of something low to the ground, darting between the rocks. His heart skipped a beat. "Zira," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. She looked up from her work, her luminous eyes instantly sharp with alertness. He pointed toward the viewport, and she followed his gaze. For a moment, the two of them stared out into the canyon, the winds swirling dust and debris through the narrow crevices of the rocks. Then they saw it: a creature, moving with an unnatural speed, skittering between the shadows. Its form was hard to make out, but Marcus caught a glimpse of glistening scales and long, clawed limbs. It was fast, almost too fast for his eyes to track, but the flash of its movement was unmistakable. Marcus's stomach twisted into a knot. He had heard the stories about Vega Prime, about the predators that roamed its barren surface, but he had hoped they were exaggerated tales told by star sailors looking to scare off new travelers. Now, he wasn't so sure. "Scraith," Zira whispered, her voice trembling with recognition. The word was foreign to Marcus, but the fear in her tone was clear. She knew what they were, and that alone was enough to set his nerves on edge. "Are they dangerous?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation. Zira's eyes darted to him, her glowing gaze filled with a quiet dread. She nodded once, sharply, then looked back toward the viewport. The creature was gone from sight, but Marcus knew it was still out there, lurking somewhere in the shadows. We should. Get inside, he suggested, his voice more steady than he felt. Lock up the ship. We're almost finished with the repairs. We can't afford to be distracted now. Zira hesitated, glancing down at the half-repaired circuit board in her hands, then back out into the canyon. Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of fear giving way to something else, determination. No, she said firmly, her voice regaining strength. We must finish. They come closer when dark. Marcus frowned. You mean they hunt at night? Zira nodded again, her hands resuming their work on the circuits with a renewed sense of urgency. They hide. Wait, until dark. That sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Nightfall wasn't far off, and the last thing they needed was a pack of those creatures surrounding the ship, waiting for the cover of darkness to attack. He glanced at the fading light outside, then back at Zira. She was right. If they were going to survive the night, they needed to get the ship functional. Now. For the next several hours, Marcus worked in silence, the tension between him and Zira palpable. Every sound outside the ship made his heart race. Every shadow seemed to twist into the form of a lurking predator. Zira was focused, her movements steady but quick, her alien features drawn tight with concentration. It was only when Marcus had finished reconnecting the last power circuit that he allowed himself to breathe. That should do it, he muttered under his breath, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. The engine, though not yet tested, hummed faintly with the promise of life. He would need to run a systems check, but for now they had done all they could. Zira stood beside him, her gaze flicking between the engine and the entrance to the ship. Her entire body was tense, and Marcus could see the fear creeping back into her posture. She wasn't afraid of the ship malfunctioning, no, she was afraid of what waited outside. As if on cue, a loud screech pierced the air, echoing through the canyon like the cry of some ancient, primal beast. Marcus's blood ran cold. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a deep, guttural noise that reverberated through the metal hull of the freighter. Zira flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the worktable as her breathing quickened. We need to move, Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. Now. Zira didn't need any further prompting. Together they rushed to the cockpit, where Marcus immediately began running diagnostics on the ship's systems. The console flickered to life, a soft hum filling the cabin as power surged through the freighter's veins. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Another screech rang out, closer this time. Marcus's hands flew over the controls, his heart pounding in his chest. Come on, he muttered, willing the ship's systems to come online faster. Zira stood at the viewport, her eyes wide as she scanned the canyon. The wind had picked up again, sending plumes of dust swirling through the air, obscuring their vision. But through the haze, Marcus caught sight of movement, several figures, low to the ground, slithering and skittering toward the ship. Marcus, Zira whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. She pointed toward the approaching creatures, her hand trembling slightly. He looked up, his stomach sinking as he saw them. There were at least 3 of them now, their sleek, reptilian bodies moving with an unnatural grace across the jagged rocks. Their scales gleamed in the fading light, and their long, spindly limbs ended in razor-sharp claws that clicked against the stone as they advanced. They're getting closer, Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. Zira turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with urgency. We must fight. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in her voice. Fight? He had no weapons powerful enough to fend off creatures like this, at least, nothing that would work outside the ship. His blaster was designed for self-defense, not hunting alien predators. But as he looked into Zira's eyes, he saw the determination there, the same fire he had seen when she first awoke. She had faced these creatures before, and despite her fear, she wasn't going to back down. Do you have a plan? Marcus asked, hoping she understood enough of his question to give him a clue. Zira's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded. She pointed toward a compartment near the back of the ship, one Marcus had never touched. It was an alien storage unit, something he hadn't been able to access without risking damage to the ship's systems. But Zira seemed to know exactly what was inside. Without another word, she hurried over to the compartment and keyed in a series of commands on the console beside it. The door hissed open, revealing a small cache of equipment, advanced alien technology that Marcus couldn't begin to understand. Zira grabbed a sleek, metallic device from the pile and turned to him. "Plasma," she said, holding it up for him to see. "Use." Marcus's eyes widened. A plasma weapon. It was far more advanced than anything he had on board, and if it worked as Zira claimed, it might just be their best chance at survival. Without wasting another second, Marcus took the weapon from her, feeling its unfamiliar weight in his hands. Zira quickly showed him how to activate it, her fingers flying over the controls as she demonstrated the basics. The weapon hummed to life, glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. "Stay inside," Marcus said, his voice steady now that he had a plan. He wasn't sure if the plasma weapon would be enough to stop the creatures, but it was better than waiting for them to tear through the ship. "I'll draw them away." Zira looked at him, her expression hardening. She shook her head vehemently, her eyes flashing with determination. "No, together." Before Marcus could argue, Zira reached for another weapon from the cache, something smaller but just as deadly. She checked the charge on the device, then met Marcus's gaze with a firm nod. There was no point in arguing. She wasn't going to sit idly by while he risked his life, and Marcus couldn't deny that he was grateful for her courage. "Fine," he said, his grip tightening on the plasma weapon. "Together." They moved quickly, exiting the freighter through the rear hatch and stepping out into the open air. The wind hit them like a wall, thick with dust and the acrid scent of the planet's unforgiving atmosphere. Marcus scanned the canyon, his pulse pounding in his ears as he searched for the Scraiths. They're slithering through the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. Marcus raised the plasma weapon, his hand steady as he aimed at the nearest creature. His finger tightened on the trigger, and with a low hum, the weapon fired, sending a burst of searing blue energy toward the Scraith. The bolt struck the creature dead center, and it let out a piercing shriek, its body convulsing as the energy tore through it. But the other two were still coming, undeterred by the death of their companion. Marcus fired again, the plasma weapon glowing with each shot, but the creatures were too fast. Zira was at his side, her smaller weapon crackling with power as she unleashed a volley of shots at the approaching Scraiths. Her aim was precise, each shot hitting its mark, but the creatures were relentless. One of them darted to the side, circling around in an attempt to flank them. "Behind you," Marcus shouted, spinning on his heel to face the creature. He fired again, but the Scraith was already too close, its claws slashing through the air toward him. In a heartbeat, Zira moved, faster than Marcus thought possible. She leaped between him and the creature, her weapon discharging a bright pulse of energy that struck the Scraith just inches from its target. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech as it crumpled to the ground, its body twitching in death. Marcus's heart raced as he stared at Zira in shock. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly, but her eyes were still sharp, focused. "You saved me," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira glanced at him, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Together." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They were a team now, whether he had planned for it or not. They would face the dangers of this world together, as equals. But there was no time for reflection. The final Scraith was still coming, its glowing eyes filled with a malevolent hunger. Marcus raised his plasma weapon, ready to fire again, but Zira was already moving. She darted forward, her weapon at the ready, and with one final burst of energy, she struck the creature down. The canyon fell silent. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. His hands trembled slightly, the weight of the plasma weapon suddenly feeling much heavier than before. The bodies of the Scraiths lay motionless on the rocky ground, their twisted forms a grim reminder of the planet's dangers. "We did it," Marcus said softly, turning to Zira. She nodded, her glowing eyes filled with a quiet strength. For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, the weight of their shared experience settling over them like a tangible force. Despite the danger, despite the fear, they had survived. Together. But as Marcus looked out over the desolate landscape, He knew this was only the beginning. The ship was almost ready, but Vika Prime was far from done with them. They had fought off the Scrates today, but tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, and Marcus knew, deep down, that they would need to rely on each other more than ever if they were going to make it off this planet alive. With a final glance at the wreckage of the creatures, Marcus turned and headed back toward the ship. Zira followed close behind, her presence a comforting reminder that they were no longer alone in this hostile world. They were a team now, and together they would survive. The silence of Vika Prime was a deception. It was the kind of quiet that masked danger, the kind that seeped into the bones and made Marcus feel as if the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rocky landscape outside the freighter was as barren as ever, the jagged cliffs casting long, eerie shadows as the pale light of Vika's twin moons filtered through the dust-filled sky. But Marcus knew better now. He had seen what lurked in the shadows, and it wasn't the kind of danger you could escape by staying inside. The Scrates had been a warning, and now there was something else. A deeper, more sinister threat. Zira had sensed it first. Her unease had grown over the past day, a tension in her every movement, a nervous glance over her shoulder that Marcus couldn't ignore. They had survived the night, but something had changed in the air, a growing heaviness that pressed down on them. As Marcus sat in the cockpit, running diagnostics on the ship's systems, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't paranoia. He had spent too many years traveling through dangerous parts of the galaxy to ignore his instincts. Vika Prime was a dead world, but it wasn't empty. Something else was out there, and it was closing in. Zira sat across from him, her glowing eyes half closed in thought as she stared at the display screens. She had grown quieter in the last few hours, speaking only when necessary and avoiding prolonged eye contact. Her fingers drummed restlessly against the arm of her seat, betraying the tension she was trying to hide. Zira, Marcus said, breaking the silence. "What's going on? You've been on edge since we fought off those Scrates. You know something, don't you?" She glanced at him, her luminous gaze softening for a moment before she spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of fear beneath her words. Pirates. The single word hung in the air between them, thick with implication. Marcus frowned. "Pirates? Here? You think they're coming for us?" Zira nodded slowly, her fingers tracing a pattern on the console's edge. "They. Track me. My ship sent. Signal before. It was destroyed. They come." Marcus's heart sank. Of course. The pirates. It all made sense now, the sudden increase in Scrate activity, the tension that had been growing ever since they started working on the ship. The pirates had picked up the signal from Zira's vessel, and they were hunting her, following the faint trail like wolves closing in on their prey. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He already knew the answer would be grim. "Not long," Zira replied, her voice barely audible. "They move. In shadows, silent." Marcus sat back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Pirates were bad news, but these weren't just any pirates. From what little Zira had told him about her past, Marcus knew these were the kind of marauders who left nothing but devastation in their wake. They hunted ships, plundering their spoils, and anyone who survived the initial attack was either enslaved or left for dead. And now they were coming here. He glanced at the ship's diagnostic screens. They had made progress enough to get the engines operational and restore power to most of the freighter's systems. But it wasn't enough. They still needed time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. Zira was staring out the viewport, her expression unreadable. Marcus had seen her fight, had witnessed the fire in her eyes when they had faced the Scrates together. But now, that fire seemed dim, flickering under the weight of her fear. He couldn't blame her. She had barely escaped the pirates once, and now they were closing in again. The trauma of what she had endured was written in every tense line of her body.
Marcus felt an overwhelming need to protect her, but the cold reality was that they were outgunned, outnumbered, and running on borrowed time.
"We can't stay here," Marcus said, his voice firmer than he felt. "We need to get the ship ready to fly now. If we wait for them to find us, we're done." Zira shook her head, her glowing eyes locking onto his with a mixture of frustration and sadness. Too late. They find us already. Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do you mean? Zira stood slowly, her movements deliberate as she stepped toward the viewport. She pointed out into the darkness beyond the canyon, her eyes narrowing. At first, Marcus saw nothing but the barren landscape, the shadows of the cliffs stretching like long fingers across the rocky ground. Then he saw them. Tiny, barely visible at first, but unmistakable, the flicker of lights in the distance, the faint glimmer of metallic shapes moving between the rocks. The pirates were here. They were coming, and they were already too close. Marcus cursed under his breath, every muscle in his body tensing with urgency. There was no time left to prepare. They had to act, and they had to act now. He turned to Zira, his mind racing. We have to move. If we stay here, we're trapped. They'll surround us, cut off our escape routes. We need to get to higher ground, somewhere defensible. Zira nodded, but her eyes were distant, haunted by memories of the last time she had faced these marauders. Marcus could see the weight of those memories bearing down on her, but he couldn't afford to let her freeze up, not now. Zira, he said, his voice firm but gentle. I need you with me. We can do this, but only if we stick together. She blinked, the glow in her eyes flickering before she nodded. Together. Marcus grabbed his blaster from the compartment beside him, checking the charge with quick, practiced motions. He didn't know how much firepower the pirates were bringing, but he had no doubt they were better equipped than he and Zira were. The plasma weapon she had given him during their fight with the Scraiths had been a lifesaver, but it wouldn't be enough against an organized pirate crew. They needed strategy. They needed to be smart. Let's go, Marcus said, grabbing a small pack of emergency supplies. We'll use the canyon walls for cover. If we can get to higher ground, we might have a shot at slowing them down. Zira didn't respond with words, but the resolve in her eyes was answer enough. Together they moved swiftly, exiting the freighter through the rear hatch and stepping into the cool night air. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake, broken only by the distant hum of the pirates' approaching ships. The canyon was a maze of towering cliffs and jagged rocks, the perfect terrain for an ambush. But Marcus had no intention of waiting to be cornered. They needed to stay ahead of their pursuers, using the natural cover to their advantage. As they moved, Marcus kept his blaster at the ready, his senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold the threat of an unseen enemy, every sound a potential warning of approaching danger. But Zira moved with an uncanny awareness of the landscape, her steps light and deliberate. She had been here longer than he had, and her knowledge of the terrain was invaluable. They scaled the rocky walls of the canyon, their hands and feet finding purchase on the rough stone as they ascended to a higher vantage point. Marcus's muscles burned with the effort, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the urgency of their situation. When they reached the top of the cliff, Marcus paused, his breath coming in heavy, shallow gasps as he surveyed the landscape below. The pirate ships were closer now, their sleek, predatory forms cutting through the night as they approached the wrecked freighter. They moved with the precision of hunters, their lights scanning the ground, searching for signs of life. Zira, Marcus whispered, turning to her. Do you see that ridge over there? He pointed toward a narrow outcropping of rock that overlooked the canyon. If we can get there, we might be able to set up a trap. We'll have the high ground, and it'll give us a chance to take out a few of them before they get too close. Zira nodded, her face set in grim determination. Yes, but they are many. Marcus didn't need her to elaborate. He knew they were outnumbered, but it was better to fight on their terms than to be caught off guard. We don't need to take them all out, he said, his voice low. We just need to slow them down long enough to finish the ship's repairs. If we can do that, we can escape. Zira glanced down at the approaching pirates, her expression hardening. They will not stop. Marcus swallowed hard. He knew she was right. These pirates weren't the type to give up easily. Once they had their prey in sight, they would pursue them relentlessly. But that didn't mean Marcus was ready to roll over and die. We'll make them stop, he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. They moved swiftly toward the ridge, staying low to avoid detection. The terrain was rough, the rocks sharp under their hands and feet, but Marcus's mind was focused on the task at hand. He needed to think like a soldier, not a merchant. He needed to use the environment to their advantage. When they reached the ridge, Marcus quickly scanned the area for anything they could use to create a trap. The rocks were unstable, the ground littered with loose stones and boulders. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "We'll set up here," Marcus said, pointing to a narrow pass that the pirates would have to cross to reach them. "We can use the rocks to slow them down, and I'll take out as many as I can with the plasma weapon." Zira nodded, her movements quick and precise, as she began arranging the rocks into a makeshift barrier. Marcus joined her, his hands working fast as they set the trap. It was a crude setup, but with any luck, it would buy them enough time. The sound of engines grew louder, the hum of the pirate ships now a constant presence in the air. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. He crouched behind the rocks, his blaster ready, the plasma weapon charged and humming softly in his hands. Zira was beside him, her own weapon drawn, her glowing eyes fixed on the pass below. The first of the pirate ships appeared, hovering just above the canyon floor, its searchlights scanning the area. Marcus could make out the figures of the pirates inside, their shadowy forms moving with the cold precision of trained killers. "Wait," he whispered to Zira, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Wait until they're in the pass." The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the tension so thick Marcus could feel it pressing against his skin. His muscles ached with the strain of holding still, but he didn't dare move. Not yet. Then, the lead pirate ship moved into the pass, its engines kicking up a cloud of dust as it maneuvered through the narrow opening. "Now," Marcus whispered. Together, he and Zira pushed with all their strength, sending the loose rocks and boulders tumbling down the ridge. The sound of the collapsing rocks echoed through the canyon, followed by the deafening crash as the debris slammed into the pirate ship, tearing into its hull and sending it spiraling out of control. The ship crashed into the canyon floor with a fiery explosion, its twisted metal frame engulfed in flames. But there was no time to celebrate. The other pirate ships were already moving, their searchlights sweeping the ridge as they realized what had happened. "Go," Marcus shouted, grabbing Zira's hand and pulling her to her feet. "We need to move now." They ran, their feet pounding against the rocky ground as they fled deeper into the canyon. The sound of blaster fire echoed behind them, the pirates opening fire as they pursued. Marcus's heart raced, every breath a painful reminder of how close they were to being caught. But they weren't giving up. Not yet. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, Marcus spotted a narrow crevice between two cliffs, a perfect hiding spot. "In here," he shouted, pulling Zira toward the opening. They squeezed into the crevice, pressing themselves against the cool stone as the pirate ships roared past overhead. The sound of their engines filled the air, but for the moment, they were hidden, safe in the shadows. Marcus's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, his hands still gripping his blaster tightly. Zira was beside him, her glowing eyes scanning the canyon for any sign of the pirates. "We can't stay here," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. "They'll find us if we stay in one place too long." Zira nodded, her face pale but determined. "We must get back to the ship." Marcus glanced at her, his mind racing. The ship. If they could just make it back, if they could finish the repairs, they had a chance. But it was a slim one. Still, it was the only chance they had. Together, they moved through the shadows, their footsteps silent as they made their way back toward the freighter. The pirate ship circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the night, but Marcus and Zira stayed low, using the rocks and cliffs for cover. When they finally reached the freighter, Marcus felt a surge of relief. The ship stood like a beacon of hope in the darkness, its engines still humming faintly with the promise of escape. "We're almost there," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet determination. But as they approached the ship, Marcus's heart stopped. Standing in front of the freighter, their blasters raised, were the pirates. They had been waiting for them. "Marcus," Zira shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Before Marcus could react, the pirates opened fire. Blaster bolts tore through the air, the sharp crack of energy weapons echoing through the canyon as Marcus and Zira dove for cover. The ground exploded around them, sending up clouds of dust and debris as the pirates closed in. "Go," Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Get inside the ship." Zira hesitated for only a moment, her eyes flashing with fear before she nodded and bolted for the freighter's hatch. Marcus followed close behind, his blaster firing blindly at the approaching pirates as he covered their retreat. They reached the hatch just as another volley of blaster fire rained down on them. Zira dove inside, her body twisting as she rolled to safety. Marcus wasn't far behind, his heart pounding as he slammed the hatch shut behind them. "We have to finish the repairs," Marcus said, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "It's our only chance." Zira didn't need to be told twice. She raced to the cockpit, her fingers flying over the controls as she began rerouting power to the engines. Marcus joined her, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he worked to stabilize the ship's systems. Outside, the pirates continued their assault, their blaster fire slamming into the hull with a relentless fury. But Marcus and Zira worked in perfect synchrony, their movements fluid and precise as they brought the freighter back to life. The ship roared to life, its engines humming with a renewed energy as the power systems surged back online. "We did it," Marcus breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. But their victory was short-lived. The pirate ships were closing in, their weapons primed and ready to tear them out of the sky. "Strap in," Marcus shouted, his hands flying over the controls as he engaged the thrusters. The freighter lurched forward, its engines roaring as it lifted off the ground. The pirate ships followed, their blasters firing in a deadly barrage as Marcus and Zira soared through the canyon, weaving between the cliffs in a desperate bid to escape. "Hold on," Marcus shouted, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls. The freighter shook violently as blaster bolts slammed into the hull, but Marcus kept his focus, his mind racing as he searched for a way out. "There's," Zira shouted, pointing to a narrow gap between the cliffs. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled the freighter into a sharp turn, the ship groaning under the strain as it squeezed through the narrow passage. The pirates were right behind them, their ships tearing through the canyon with deadly precision. But as Marcus guided the freighter through the treacherous terrain, something changed. The pirates faltered. The narrow cliffs became their undoing, their ships slamming into the rocks as they struggled to keep up with Marcus's evasive maneuvers. One by one, the pirate ships fell, their twisted forms crashing into the canyon walls with a fiery explosion. Marcus let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding, his heart pounding in his chest as the freighter finally broke free of the canyon. "We made it," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Zira nodded, her eyes wide with shock but filled with a quiet strength. Together they soared through the night sky, leaving the pirates and the dangers of Vega Prime far behind. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free. The freighter hummed softly beneath Marcus's hands, its engines now fully operational, vibrating with a reassuring thrum that carried them through the darkened void of space. The distant stars glittered coldly, indifferent to the chaos they had just escaped. But inside the cockpit, there was a palpable shift, an air of exhaustion tempered by relief. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the controls, as the freighter settled into the steady rhythm of sub-light speed. His heart was finally beginning to slow, though the adrenaline still coursed through his veins like a stubborn echo of the fight they had barely survived. Zira sat in the co-pilot's seat beside him, her glowing eyes fixed on the viewport. She hadn't said a word since they escaped the pirates, her hands resting limply in her lap, her posture rigid. The flickering lights of the ship's console cast shadows across her face, but Marcus could see the tension in her expression, the exhaustion etched in the tightness of her jaw and the furrow of her brow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two survivors, bound by a shared ordeal, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Marcus who broke the quiet first. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his tousled hair. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse from the hours of tension and shouting. He glanced at Zira, who remained still, her eyes distant. "We're finally free." Zira blinked slowly, as if pulled from some faraway memory, and turned her gaze toward him. The light in her eyes flickered briefly, and she offered a small nod. Yes, she whispered, though her voice lacked the conviction Marcus had hoped to hear. It wasn't surprising. Freedom was a fragile concept for someone like Zira, someone who had been running for so long, never truly free from the shadow of the pirates that had hunted her across the stars. Even now, as the freighter glided away from Vika Prime, leaving the deadly planet and the wreckage of their enemies behind, Marcus could see the weight of Zira's past still clinging to her. Marcus shifted in his seat, his hands still resting on the controls, but his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that the danger was over, that they had survived the worst. But he knew that wasn't entirely true. They had escaped, yes, but the scars of what they had endured, both physical and emotional, would linger. He cleared his throat, his voice softer now. "Zira, I know things aren't perfect, but we're alive. That's something, right?" Zira didn't answer immediately. Her glowing eyes drifted toward the viewport again, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "They will not stop." Marcus frowned, his chest tightening. "The pirates." She nodded, her fingers twitching slightly in her lap. "They have others. They always find. The ones they hunt." Marcus felt a surge of frustration, not at Zira, but at the cruel reality of her situation. It wasn't fair. She had barely escaped with her life, had survived horrors that would have broken most people. And now, even with the vastness of space separating them from Vika Prime, she still wasn't free. The pirates were like a shadow that followed her no matter how far she ran. "I won't let them find us," Marcus said, his voice firm, though he wasn't entirely sure how he'd keep that promise. "We've got a head start now. We can lay low for a while, find somewhere safe." Zira shook her head, her expression pained. Safe, the word came out with a bitter edge, as if it were a distant, unreachable dream. Nowhere is safe. Marcus's heart ached at the defeat in her voice. He had seen glimpses of her strength, the fierce warrior who had fought alongside him against the Scraiths, the survivor who had faced down the pirates with unwavering determination. But beneath that strength, Zira was carrying the weight of so much pain, so much loss. And now that the immediate danger had passed, that weight seemed heavier than ever. He leaned forward, his gaze softening as he spoke. "I don't know if there's a place out there that's completely safe, Zira. But you don't have to keep running alone. We'll figure something out, together." For the first time since they'd escaped, Zira turned to face him fully. Her glowing eyes, so alien and yet so expressive, searched his face as if trying to decipher his words. There was a vulnerability in her gaze that Marcus hadn't seen before, a flicker of uncertainty mixed with something deeper, hope, perhaps, though it was buried beneath layers of fear. "You would stay?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Even if danger follows?" Marcus held her gaze, his chest tightening with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He had been a loner for most of his life, drifting from one job to the next, never staying in one place long enough to make lasting connections. But something had shifted in him since meeting Zira, something that made him want to protect her, to stand by her side no matter what dangers lay ahead. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "Not without you." Zira's eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, Marcus saw the faintest glimmer of something, trust, perhaps, or the beginning of it. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the ship's console let out a sharp beep, interrupting the moment. Marcus turned his attention back to the controls, his brow furrowing as he scanned the readouts. The ship's sensors had picked up something, a faint signal, distant but unmistakable. "Hang on," he muttered, adjusting the ship's scanners to get a clearer reading. The signal was weak, barely detectable, but it was definitely there. His fingers flew over the controls, narrowing the search until the data on the screen sharpened into something more coherent. "It's a distress beacon," Marcus said, his voice filled with surprise. "A ship not too far from here." Zira leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data on the screen. "Is it pirates?" Marcus shook his head. "No, the signal's too weak. It's an automated beacon, probably a stranded ship or someone in need of help." Zira's expression shifted, her brow furrowing with concern. "We should avoid. Too dangerous." Marcus hesitated. She wasn't wrong. They had just barely escaped with their lives, and they were in no position to get involved in another rescue mission. But something about the signal tugged at him. He had been the one sending out distress calls not too long ago, stranded on Vega Prime with little hope of survival. What if this was someone like him alone, desperate, clinging to the hope that someone would answer their call? "We should at least check it out," Marcus said, glancing at Zira. "We don't have to get involved if it's dangerous, but what if it's someone who needs help? We can't just ignore it." Zira's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flicking between Marcus and the console. She was torn, he could see it in the way her fingers drummed anxiously against her knee. The instinct to survive was strong in her, and after everything she had been through, she had every reason to be cautious. But there was also compassion in her, buried beneath the layers of fear. Marcus had seen it in the way she had cared for him, the way she had fought to protect him, even when her own life was on the line. After a long moment, Zira let out a quiet sigh and nodded. "We check. But, careful." Marcus smiled, relieved by her decision. "Careful," he agreed. He adjusted the ship's trajectory, guiding the freighter toward the source of the distress beacon. The stars outside the viewport shifted as the ship changed course, the faint signal growing stronger as they approached. As they drew closer, the outline of the stranded ship came into view, illuminated by the soft glow of its flickering emergency lights. It was a small vessel, likely a personal craft or a transport ship, its hull battered and scarred from what looked like a meteorite impact. The ship was drifting aimlessly, its engines offline, but there was no sign of life, at least, not from what Marcus could see. "I'm not picking up any life signs," Marcus said, frowning as he studied the ship's silhouette. "But that doesn't mean much. The sensors could be malfunctioning." Zira's eyes remained fixed on the ship, her expression unreadable. "We approach, cautious." Marcus nodded, guiding the freighter closer until they were within range of the ship's docking port. He activated the ship's comms, sending a signal to the stranded vessel. "This is the freighter Venture, responding to your distress call," Marcus said into the comms. "Can anyone hear me?" The only response was static. Marcus tried again, adjusting the frequency to see if he could break through the interference. "This is the freighter Venture. We've picked up your distress signal and are standing by to assist. Please respond." There was a long pause, and then, faintly, a voice crackled through the static. "Help, please. Anyone." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The voice was weak, barely audible over the crackling interference, but it was unmistakably human. "We hear you," Marcus said, his voice steady. "What's your situation?" The voice came again, filled with desperation. "Engines. Offline. Life support failing. Trapped." Marcus glanced at Zira, who nodded silently. There was no question now they had to help. "Hang tight," Marcus said into the comms. "We're coming aboard. We'll get you out of there." He stood from his seat, grabbing his blaster and a portable tool kit from the storage compartment. "Let's go." Zira followed him without hesitation, her own weapon at the ready as they made their way to the airlock. The freighter shuddered slightly as the docking clamps engaged, sealing them to the stranded ship's airlock. Marcus took a deep breath as the airlock doors hissed open, revealing the dimly lit corridor of the other ship. The atmosphere inside was stale, the lights flickering weakly as the ship's failing system struggled to maintain power. "Stay close," Marcus said quietly, his blaster raised as he led the way down the narrow corridor. Zira moved beside him, her eyes scanning the shadows with a practiced wariness. They reached the main cabin of the ship, where the voice had come from. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, cramped room filled with control panels and scattered debris. In the center of the room, slumped against one of the consoles, was a figure human, dressed in a tattered flight suit, their face pale and gaunt. They looked up weakly as Marcus and Zira entered, their eyes wide with fear and relief. You came, the person whispered, their voice trembling. We're here, Marcus said, stepping forward and kneeling beside the injured pilot. You're safe now. The pilot's eyes flicked to Zira, widening slightly as they took in her alien appearance. But there was no fear in their gaze, only gratitude. Thank you, the pilot whispered, their voice barely more than a breath. Zira knelt beside Marcus, her expression softening as she examined the pilot's injuries. We take you to ship, she said gently. You will live. Marcus nodded, offering the pilot a reassuring smile. Let's get you out of here. Together, Marcus and Zira helped the pilot to their feet, supporting them as they made their way back to the freighter. The ship groaned ominously as they moved, its failing systems on the verge of collapse, but they made it to the airlock just in time. As the doors sealed behind them, Marcus let out a sigh of relief. They had done it, they had saved a life. And for the first time since their ordeal on Vika Prime, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone in this vast, unforgiving galaxy. Maybe, together they could find a way to survive and to heal. As they guided the injured pilot to the med bay, Marcus glanced at Zira, who met his gaze with a quiet, knowing look. They didn't need to speak. The bond between them was stronger than words, forged in the fires of survival and shared hardship. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. And that, Marcus realized, was enough. For now, they were free. For now, they had hope.